know quite a few of you, but probably not everybody. I'm Derek Bristol. I'm a caver in Denver, Colorado, and I'm going to give a talk on Great Expectations Cave, which probably most of you know is in the Bighorn Mountains. It's in north central Wyoming, and it's an NSS preserve, one of 17 NSS preserves. And we started a project about 2 years ago now to do a resurvey. And then the resurvey, the intent is eventually for that to sort of start a new era of exploration in the cave. So I'm going to put a presentation up here and kind of walk through, mostly focused on work we did this past summer. Where is my presentation? Sometimes it shows me my keynote and sometimes it doesn't. Let's try desktop. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
All right. So a little bit of history and a little bit of background, a little bit of context for Great Expectations Cave. Again, probably most of you are aware of it. It's commonly just referred to as Great X. There's a map of Wyoming there on the right and a few waypoints. That kind of cluster of waypoints up at the top center is where Great X is located. It's on the western side of the Bighorn Mountains. It has a surveyed length just under 6 miles. That was a survey that was done in the late 70s and early 80s. And as far as I am aware, the last survey trip was in 1985 when Pete Shiflett and a group of folks spent 3 weeks there and surveyed the lower part of the Lost Worland River. And I don't think there's been any work done since then. It's one of the deepest caves in the US, a little over 1,400 feet in depth. And one of the things that's really unique about that is that the high point of the cave is basically the great entrance, and the low point is very near the great exit on the western end of the cave. And so those two entrances allow a through trip, which is the deepest through trip of the US. At the time that it was surveyed at 1,403 feet of depth, again, back in the 1980s, was the deepest cave in the US. It's since been surpassed by a few other caves. I think it might be 5th deepest or something like that now. And I think it's the 2nd deepest in Wyoming. But again, the thing that's unique about it is that there are entrances on both ends of that depth range. There is a little more potential. There's a resurgence that's maybe about 400 vertical feet below the great exit. The stream doesn't actually come out the great exit. It goes into a too tight crack, but it seems unlikely that 400 vertical feet is going to be passable without significant blasting or something like that. So I mentioned it's an NSS cave preserve. It's one of only 2 in the western US. The other one's in Oklahoma. And they acquired it in early 2003. The great exit is on BLM land. So there's the cave passes underneath land that's owned by a few different private property owners. About half of it's under BLM land and roughly half is under private land. And so the great entrance is owned by the NSS. I think they have something like 40 acres. And that's managed by Bob Montgomery and Savannah Sawyer. And the exit is, the great exit is on BLM land, but there really aren't any restrictions by the BLM for access to it, which is good. The entrance to the cave was sort of discovered by cavers. I think it was probably known earlier than this, but first discovered by cavers and surveyed in 1972 by Chris Hill and a couple other folks. And Chris was one of the co-authors in this book that's shown on the right here, Caves of Wyoming. Again, a lot of you are probably familiar with this. And so the Sinks of Trapper Creek Cave, I think it was called, was described in this book, which came out in 1976. And I think partly because of the publication of the book, it got some interest from cavers in the Sheridan area who came over and started looking in the entrance room and digging in the breakdown there. And in 1977, they were able to get through what was called the Crisco crack. And I think rumors are that it was only about 9 inches wide originally. And I think they had to remove quite a bit of rock just to get to it to begin with. And it's been enlarged a little bit. It's now about 12 inches wide. So it's not really a squeeze, but it's definitely kind of awkward spot. And that's where the gate is located. So originally, I'm not sure when the gate was put in, but I think probably after the NSS acquired it, the gate was installed. Fairly simple gate. So the survey started right after they got through 1977. Most of the early survey work was done by Wyoming and Montana cavers. And you can see the original map by Chris Hill on the right there that's in Caves, Wyoming, Sinks of Trapper Creek Cave. And when they got through, they renamed it Great Expectations. And I think the reason for that, my understanding is that there was, it's a sink, so it takes a stream, Trapper Creek flows in and then sinks into the ground there and goes into a stream passage in the cave. But there was also pretty strong airflow, and it's chimney effect airflow, so it changes depending on the temperature outside, but at times it can be quite strong. And I think the strong airflow and the water that was being taken into the cave both were indications that there was probably a significant cave there. So Great Expectations became the new name when they got in and started surveying it. A caver by the name of Andy Flurkey was very involved in 1977 and 1978. He knew John Shelton's, Dave Springhetti, and some of those folks, and invited them to come help survey it. And they first arrived in 78. And some of the early discoveries they made were Cephalopod Malt Shop and then the Great Hall. And out at the end of the Great Hall, they found the route down to Lost Worland River, which is the same water that sinks into the entrance. So it's flows along the surface for a ways as Trapper Creek, and then sinks into the ground. You see it in the cave for a distance where it flows out to the Cephalopod Malt Shop. And in Cephalopod Malt Shop, there's a sump. So the water disappears there, and then it reemerges several thousand feet away in Lost Worland River. And so they spent a couple of years pushing the river downstream between 78 and 1980. They had pushed the survey as far as Connection Falls, which is quite a long distance, something like 200 survey shots, maybe about 2 miles of passage in pretty cold stream passage. And also in 1980, towards the end of the summer, the Dumb Luck entrance was discovered. So there were folks that were going down canyon in Trapper Creek, which is below the great entrance. There's a dry surface valley, and they were ridge walking down valley, and this cave entrance, which was called Dumb Luck at the time, was discovered in 1980. And about a week after it was discovered, Tom Miller and Pete Shiflett went to take a look at it, and went and explored upstream, and the stream they found there. And as soon as they got to the stream, which is a couple hundred feet inside the entrance, it was obvious to them that it was the same water that was flowing through Great Expectations Cave. It was similar volume and heading in the direction of the Dumb Luck entrance. And so they kind of knew what it was. And the story is, their first trip in there, they found the stream a couple hundred feet inside, and it pretty quickly turns into a crawlway about 1.5 to 2 feet high. And they crawled upstream in the river through what was later named the Grim Crawl of Death. It's about 1,000 feet long, belly crawling in the river. And they got through and got to where it opens back up into 15-foot high passage and continued to follow that upstream. And Pete's version of the story is that they had brought survey gear with them and had intended to survey their way back out, but that Tom Miller kind of pushed them and prodded them, and they kept exploring upstream until eventually they reached Connection Falls. And Pete had been on a survey trip where they had surveyed down to Connection Falls from the Great Entrance, and they continued to go all the way back up, following the cave up and out the Great Entrance, and completed the first through trip. They did that without ropes rigged, apparently. So this is the part of the story that's a little hard for me to square, because I've seen Connection Falls and I've seen some of the chimneys right before base camp on that through trip, and it's kind of hard to imagine free climbing up some of those. Some of the drops that are rigged today, it's definitely a possibility, but there's at least 2 spots in there that I think would be pretty sporting to do without ropes, without fixed ropes, but that's apparently what they did. And they caught a bit of heat for this. So the folks that were surveying from above were put off by the fact that they had scooped almost half the cave in this big epic trip. And a lot of the survey effort kind of died in 1980 as a result of that. And I mentioned earlier, Pete organized kind of a mini expedition to go back and survey the lower part of the cave, sort of as penance for having scooped it in 1980. So it did finally get surveyed. A little bit about the geology. The cave is formed in dolomite as opposed to limestone. It's in the Bighorn dolomite, which is about 450 million years old. It's Ordovician aged. It's in the, I mentioned the Bighorn Mountains, which was formed when the Rocky Mountains formed. And you can see in this stratigraphy chart on the right here from Caves of Wyoming that the Bighorn Dolomites ranges from 300 to 570 feet in thickness, and yet the cave is 1,400 feet deep. So a lot of that depth is because of the dip of the sedimentary rocks in that area. So the Bighorn Mountains are an uplifted mountain range, and the sedimentary rocks around the perimeter of the Bighorns give it, allow it to achieve that greater depth. So you enter the cave sort of where the Dolomite's exposed on the east side, and then the cave follows the Dolomite as it dips to the west, and so you get a lot of the elevation loss from that dip. And so I mentioned already that the cave is deepest in the U.S. When it was first explored. It's kind of an area map here, topographic map that shows you the couple of waypoints. I don't think my pointer works when I'm sharing my screen, but the couple of waypoints on the right side there are the area where we camp on the east side of the road, and on the west side of the road is the Great Entrance, where the NSS property is. And then you can see the green, sort of faint green boundary that marks BLM land, and that specifically is a wilderness study area, so they call it the Trapper Creek Wilderness Study Area. I think it's been a wilderness study area for a couple of decades now, and it takes an act of Congress to get these things designated as wilderness. So it's sort of treated as though it's wilderness and it has wilderness characteristics, but it's pretty difficult to get things through Congress these days, so it may remain that way for a while. But the Trapper Creek sinks at about 8,600 feet elevation, and then the Great Exit is at 7,200 feet. And you can see Trapper Creek. It does show on the topo map a blue line indicating water. There is surface water that flows through that area intermittently, but it's about another mile downstream in Trapper Creek Valley or Gorge, where the water from Lost Worland River reemerges. And again, I think it's too tight to get in where the resurgence is and where the near the great exit where the stream sinks, it's like 6 or 8 inches high and it's full of water. So there's not really a good option of getting into it from either end. But if you come out the great exit, there's a pretty steep canyon you have to hike out of. It's about 1,000 vertical foot climb over 1.5 miles, which if you're hiking on a trail isn't so bad, but it's very steep and loose and there's not really a trail there. We did some work this year to flag that to make it easier to follow, but there's a series of game trails, but a lot of it's not very easy to hike. And to get from one entrance to the other on the surface, you would follow, most of it you follow Alkali Road, which is 2-wheel drive road, but the last 3.5 or 4 miles is 4-wheel drive, high clearance 4-wheel drive road to get over to where you'd park to hike down or hike out. So I mentioned that we started a resurvey in 2018, and I've been asked a number of times why we're doing that, because there is a map. And there's, if you've seen the map, many people have been in the cave and have copies of that old map, don't find it particularly useful. There's not a lot of detail in it. I think the survey data is accurate, but the sketch details doesn't represent the cave very well. And it's, and on top of that, most of the old survey stations have been wiped out. Either they used flagging tape in the upper part of the cave, and for whatever reason, those have been removed, or there's, they used carbide, and in some cases, those things got washed away by flood, those markers. So recovering survey stations is not real practical anymore. So one of the reasons to resurvey is to improve the detail and accuracy of the map. It's a pretty important cave, I think, by Western caving standards, and also being an NSS preserve. It'd be great to have a higher quality map than the old one. With modern instruments, we feel like we can improve the accuracy a bit. I think they were using Bruntons and they didn't do back sights on most of the old original surveys. They did do a surface survey, so there is a sort of a big loop that so they can distribute the error, but I'm not really sure how good the closure was. I suspect not that good, but surveying the river in particular is pretty challenging, and so it would be easy to make mistakes during the course of that. The other thing is that the original survey didn't have a profile view, and being 1,400 feet deep, it's a fairly vertical cave. It would be nice to have a good profile view map of it. And then the other thing is there are definitely a number of significant side passages, cut-arounds, and things like that. So there's a lot more to be explored. And as we do that, we want to be able to survey and add to the map. And without good tie-in stations, it's impossible to do a good job with any new survey. So resurveying the old main route through the cave creates a framework for doing new exploration. So I just want to mention briefly, whenever resurveys are done, I think there's oftentimes some hesitation. There's some concern that it's that this is like a criticism of the original explorers, and that's really not the case at all. I think this is a really difficult cave to survey, even with modern equipment. It would have been really daunting 40 years ago. And they did a really amazing job of surveying it at all. But the equipment's gotten better. The standards have changed. So many projects I'm involved with across the country didn't do back sights back in the 80s. And so the standards for detail and sketches and the standards for accuracy and stuff like that have changed. So it's not intended as a criticism of the original explorers, just that with most projects, these things need to be updated eventually. Our survey effort will need to be updated as well, and once helmet-mounted LiDAR units are cheap and widely available, then our survey will probably be obsolete as well. So we did a couple of trips. I mentioned we got in there in 2018 and just did sort of a reconnaissance. It was my first trip to the cave, and it sort of solidified my interest in doing a resurvey there. And we did a weekend trip in 2019. Some folks that are on the call, Doug Warner was along on that trip. But we had 2 survey teams over a weekend, and we took the survey all the way out beyond the end of the Great Hall and a little ways into what's called the Flowstone Gallery beyond the Great Hall. We didn't get as far as the river, but we surveyed about 3,500 feet over the weekend, which is pretty productive. It's nice when you can start at an entrance. Travel times are pretty short. It's not the case anymore. So this year, kind of an overview of what we did in August. We had a week-long expedition. See the play on words there? And we had 21 participants from 7 different states, mostly Rocky Mountain area cavers. Sean Thomas lives in Oregon, and he was out in Wyoming doing some field work, I think, for that conservation that he works for. And so he joined us. Sonia Meyer came out from California. We had some restrictions for participants that they had to get screened for COVID, and they had to practice all of the best practices, and they weren't allowed to arrive by airplane. So anybody that wanted to participate had to come by car. And so we had Hazel Barton and George Brealey came all the way from Ohio. Sonia drove all the way out from California with her husband Joey, who also participated for a day. And I mentioned Sean coming out from Oregon. So we had people come from pretty far away to participate. We camped on National Forest land, which is just adjacent to the NSS property. And we haven't done any camping in the cave. I've been asked a number of times, and I'm still, even now that the end of the survey is something like 5 hours travel from the entrance, I'm still a little reluctant to camp in the cave. It's pretty wet and miserable conditions. We've been able to get to a room called Base Camp, which would be a logical place to have a camp, I suppose, but we can get there in not much more than an hour from the entrance. And then it's another 4 hours of travel in the river to get to the end of the survey. And it would be pretty difficult and maybe not very comfortable conditions to camp anywhere along the river. There are some bypass areas, but even those have pools, and there aren't any great flat, dry spots to set up a camp. So we're probably going to continue to do sort of marathon trips and camp on the surface. We used a COVID mitigation plan that Hazel developed to try to reduce the risk. We certainly don't tell people that that if they follow that protocol that there is no risk. It would be dishonest to say that. So we did everything that we thought was practical or reasonable to reduce the likelihood of passing disease or bringing the disease to the expedition. So some of those things are listed here. We ask people to practice social distancing, which is always a good idea, regardless of expeditions or not. We ask people to get tested prior to the trip. I mentioned no travel by plane. Anybody experiencing any symptoms was asked not to participate, to self-exclude. And we did temperature checks on a daily basis. So a lot of what you see reported as asymptomatic, people being asymptomatic, in many cases they do exhibit a slight increase in temperature. And so we've been, it's a good way to sort of catch this thing, even though people aren't feeling feverish or aren't feeling sick. We also practice social distancing amongst the team for the first 5 days of the expedition. And if people continued to show low temperature and remain asymptomatic, then we kind of loosened that restriction a bit. And we tried to reduce, or we tried to limit people showing up late to the expedition so that we could loosen those restrictions on social distancing. Some of the objectives, we wanted to, there's an interest in completing the survey of the Lost Worland River. That's a big task. There's about 4 miles of river, and it's pretty hard to get to from either end of the cave. But we wanted to try to survey as much of that as possible. We wanted to survey the Cephalopod Malt Shop, which was just sort of a side passage off the entrance area. It's not sort of the main travel route if you're doing a through trip, but it's a significant side passage. There's another significant side passage area called Shredder Maze that's off of the Great Hall. We wanted to get some survey done in there. We've been pretty successful at that. Survey the Grim Crawl of Death was one of the objectives. We started that, and we've had teams in there at least on 3 different days. But we've got a bit of work left to do. It's a pretty difficult survey, as you might imagine. And we wanted to make some improvements to the rigging. So there are 3 fixed ropes. They're fixed ropes now. I guess there's three chimneys in the entrance that lead down into the breakdown area below the entrance itself. And then once you get past the Great Hall, there's 3 more ropes that lead down to the Lost Worland River. Once you're in the river, there's another 6 rope drops now if you're doing a full through trip. And so there's several rig pitches, and many of those have bolt anchors. Many of the old bolt anchors are corroded and were placed in the 80s using kind of substandard anchors. And so we worked on trying to replace a lot of that. Other objectives, we did a bit of work on the surface, including improving the trail from the Great Exit. So we wanted to flag that. And we've also now marked it with reflective markers. And we wanted to conduct a through trip. I'd not been on one, and most of the people that were involved in the expedition had not done it. I think we had a couple people. Bob Montgomery had been on a through trip, and Carl Byrne had been on one, but they had no interest in doing another one. Most of the people I've talked to that have been on a through trip, one time was enough for them. But there was a concern. Bob Montgomery's had some concern for a while that we're losing knowledge about the cave, that it's not seen a lot of visitation over the last several years. And the last through trip was in 2014. And the one prior to that was 2009. So there's only been 2 through trips in the last 11 years. And it's one of these things that to do it, you really want to have somebody that's familiar with the cave, familiar with the route. It's difficult enough even if you know where you're going. And with a long list of people that have done it once and don't want to do it again, Bob had a concern that we were kind of losing knowledge about the cave. And so so doing a through trip, even though the way we planned it was just a recreational trip, we thought it would be good to get familiar with the cave by doing this. And I'll explain a little bit about that later. But got a couple of pictures here of where we camped on National Forest land. This is, again, just across the road from the NSS property. And I'll talk a little bit about the entrance area. This is, there's a big cliff band and kind of a breakdown collapse where the entrance is. We installed a hand line across there, and then we went back in September and did a shorter long weekend trip where we added basically a ladder across the entrance. I'll show you in the next slide what the old bridge looked like. But we've gone ahead and improved that. We put in a new bolt anchor inside the Crisco crack. Previously, you could rig to breakdown blocks, but the dolomite there is quite sharp, and there's definitely sharp edges around breakdown blocks inside the entrance. And then we also in the entrance area added a hand line, and we kind of flagged the entrance area with orange flagging. There was some flagging in there already, but it's a kind of convoluted route. It goes through breakdown, and there's a couple of confusing junction areas, and so it can be easy to get lost in there. There's definitely stories about people going and not finding where they're trying to get to. And we reasoned that because it's a gated cave and it's permit access, and the access folks do a pretty good job of screening people, that if you had a permit and you had permission to be in the cave, that there's no reason not to make it easier for people to find different destinations. So we added orange flagging through that entrance area. A short a little video clip showing you the entrance. There was a big breakdown, a big collapse. You can see loose rock on the left side of the video there. That's part of a cliff face that fell down sometime between summer of 2018 and 2019. So you can, just by looking at it, you can kind of get a sense that it's not the most stable place. So we try not to linger in the entrance for too long. This is looking back out of the entrance, photo by Hazel Barton. And you can see the sort of makeshift log bridge that was installed there. There's 4 sort of skinny logs across that gap. And it doesn't look that bad from this angle, but you're about 10 feet up and it's loose and sharp breakdown if you fell off of there. So we've replaced that with something a little more stable. This is the Crisco crack. That's Jake McLeod, and you can see the gate just behind him. So again, this was reportedly was originally about 9 inches and is now around 12. And then just inside the Crisco crack is a series of 3 chimneys. This is the first one. That's Avon Burn on rope. The old, I don't know if I should use that term. The old timers, I'm going to use it. The old timers described that they always free climb these chimneys, which you can definitely do. But it's the first 2 chimneys are about 80 vertical feet. And I would call it something like 5-3 climbing, maybe 5-2 climbing, something like that. It's fairly easy, but it's also entirely vertical. And if you lost your footing, it would not be a soft landing. So it's probably the safe thing to do is to rig a rope and then use vertical gear. They're kind of narrow chimneys, so it's a little awkward climbing up them, but at the very least, if you wear a harness and use a hand ascender or something, a safety ascender for self-belay, it's probably a safer way to go. But we do occasionally climb these or hand line the entrance chimneys. But the first 2 chimneys are like this, or maybe 2 feet wide or so, 1.5 feet wide. And then below those is the Velcro chimney. And this thing's only about 10 inches wide. And this is the way the dolomite sort of weathers, or as water erodes it, it forms this Velcro rock they call Velcro rock. And it can be pretty sharp and snaggy in places. Some places it's not so bad, but Velcro chimney, it's pretty snaggy, and combined with the fact that it's narrow here, it's pretty effective at tearing cave suits. So you don't really need a rope in here. It's narrow enough that, and grabby enough that you can just inhale and stop any kind of fall. It's pretty hard to fall down this thing. But I've torn a cave suit in here, and I know most people that have gone through here have torn something at some point or another. The thing about this dolomite is you can't sort of push or slide yourself through it like you would normally in a cave. You kind of have to release yourself. If you feel any part of your clothing catch or whatever, you have to kind of back up and unhook yourself rather than try to push through, or it'll just tear the fabric. So we spent a couple teams have gone down to the Cephalopod Malt Shop, and there's actually kind of a network of passages down there. I was sort of thinking it might be one day a survey effort to do this thing, but I think we've had teams in the Cephalopod Malt Shop area 5 or 6 days now, and there's still side passages left to survey. But the water that comes in the entrance comes out near the bottom of the Velcro chimney, and then it goes through kind of an entrance breakdown area. And you can follow that water all the way out to this room, the Cephalopod Malt Shop, and it's named for these large cephalopod fossils that are pretty prominent in the bedrock there. But it's also just a beautiful room from a hydrologic standpoint. There's this really cool waterfall and cool sump pool in the middle of the room. And it's known for the fossils, and it's also known for soda straws. So out at the western end of the room, it goes for quite a distance, and there's sort of thousands of, they're short soda straws, but there's a lot of them. Pretty spectacular. And this is one of the areas you can see soda straws on the ceiling, and then large cephalopod fossils in the floor. And there's and I don't know if it's chert, there's definitely chert nodules embedded in a lot of the dolomite, but there's either layers of sandstone or chert throughout the cave in areas. And as you get into the Lost Worland River, you see this the same bedding in several places where the water flows across the top of it. It's less soluble than the dolomite. And there are places throughout Lost Worland River where you can see these large cephalopod fossils embedded in this layer. So it's pretty spectacular. So another neat feature of the cave is the Great Hall. We spent 3 days surveying a side passage off the Great Hall called an area called Shredder Maze. There's very strong airflow out there. So a lot of the folks that have been out there are like, yeah, it turns into a pretty crawly area, but it has tremendous airflow, which is kind of encouraging. So there's a lot of folks, even though the area's pretty tight and crawly, are interested in going back out and pushing that. We also spent a couple of days surveying other side passages off the Great Hall. Most of that's done. There's just still a few mop-up things. And we've looked at some of the climbing leads. So the old map showed areas of the Great Hall that were more than 150 feet high. At least it was indicated on the map. And I don't think we've found anything that's more than about 80 feet high, but it's still a pretty large passage. And it follows a fault. So the ceiling, you can see, kind of follows a joint or fault throughout most of its length. But there are some high alcoves up near the ceiling that are worth exploring in the future. We went and scouted some of those in August and made notes of where some of these climbing leads look like they're worth climbing up into. We didn't see anything that was, we had brought climbing gear, but ended up not doing any climbs in August, but there's definitely some that are worth going back to and taking a look at. So once you get out to the end of Great Hall, go a little ways. We surveyed another 40 stations in August to get to the Lost Worland River, and then we have surveyed another 150 stations down the river in August, and then we've added another 100 stations to that in September. So, so we're about 2 miles down the river now, just short of Connection Falls. I say this presentation was put together after the August expedition. So it's about 40% of the river's been completed. And I'd say it's maybe just over 50% now. And there's probably, if you include the Grim Crawl, we've got about 200 more survey stations based on the old original survey left to do. And some of that is pretty lengthy. So most of the river that we've surveyed up to this point, we've averaged somewhere around 30 feet per survey shot. And I think when we get down past Connection Falls, there aren't as many meanders, and there's some really long straight stretches of stream passage. And I think we'll get to where the average survey shot's over 50 feet. So distance-wise, even though we're more than halfway in terms of survey shots, we're probably half or a little less than halfway in terms of distance. But we did some rigging in the river. We replaced some of the old bolts at Gonzo Falls, and we did quite a bit more rigging in September and replaced the anchors at Connection Falls. The anchors at B52 Falls were about the only good ones in the cave. They were stainless steel. I think they were placed. I'm not sure exactly when they were placed. I think they were placed in 2005, but they are stainless, so they look to be in good shape. So a few shots of Lost Worland River, kind of give you a sense for what it's like. I'm not really sure about water flow. It was lower for us in September than it was in August. I didn't think the water level seemed all that high, but I don't have much of a point of reference. Some of the folks like Pete Shiflett that have seen a video I made of the trip have commented that the water looked like it was really high. But I think there was a through trip that was done in 2009 that was written up in the NSS News, and it sounds like those guys had much higher water flow. I think Doug was there for that, although I don't think he was on the through trip, but he was in the cave then, and I may have gone to the river. But they had a series of snowstorms, and then the snow melted, and I think they saw pretty high water flow for their trip. So I'm not real sure. I think the flow we had in August was probably about average from different reports I hear, but it can be lower, it can be higher. You definitely don't want to be in there when there's a threat of rain, so we watch the weather forecast pretty carefully. You get snow melt early in the year, so going in prior to the beginning of July is a little difficult. And as we have found out, because we had sort of tentatively scheduled another trip up there for this past weekend, and the temperatures were down as low as 2 degrees, and I think they're in the midst of 10 days or more of snow. So I don't think the area is accessible anymore. So sometime between July and early October is kind of the season. You have kind of a short season, but yeah, you want to avoid going in the cave when there's any threat of rain for sure. Another shot from Lost Worland River. This is just a short section where the river goes low and there's kind of a dry overpass, but you can see how scalloped that dolomite is and how sharp it can be. Will tear at your gloves and knee pads and cave suits and wetsuits. The water in there is the water and air temperature around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and so about the same temperature as the inside of your refrigerator. So if you're in the water, you need neoprene gloves and at least a 5mm, if not a 7mm wetsuit. And we wear hoods and thicker gloves and stuff, and neoprene socks, of course, for if you're doing a through trip and you go through the Groom Crawl, you end up spending something around an hour belly crawling in this water. So you need pretty good insulation for that. This is a short drop, one of the newer ones that we rigged. There's 3 sort of short drops like this in the river that didn't have ropes or anchors, and we've added those because we thought it would add to the safety and convenience. And then there's sort of 3 main drops that we changed or improved the rigging on. This is kind of a little bit wider section. Most of the Lost Worland River is, say, 8 to 12 feet wide. Some places it gets a little wider, but it's a series of short waterfalls and then deep plunge pools. And you end up doing quite a lot of climbing because the rock's pretty grippy and lots of pockets and stuff. So there's lots of hand and footholds. But to avoid the deep water and having to climb in and out of potholes constantly, you end up sort of chimneying or climbing across most of them. If you're Nick, you can chimney when it's 12 feet wide. More shots of Lost Worland River. Some areas of the river, the ceiling is 100 feet high, and then there's places where it lowers like this, but there may be kind of meanders. There might be areas where there's cut-arounds and stuff where this deep canyon is sort of split into 2, where the active stream level might be going one direction and the paleo to upper part of the canyon may be essentially like a separate passage that's going off in a different direction. This is B52 Falls. It's 25 or 30 feet. It's one of the bigger drops. So I'll talk briefly about the Great Exit in the Groom Crawl of Death. We spent a couple days working down in that area. There was in total 4 days of trail work done. So some of that was cutting out logs. There was a lot of deadfall and wind, trees that were blown down from windstorms. And some of that, Carl and Savannah have done some work to clear those logs out. And then teams went in with machetes to clear some of the smaller brush and smaller trees. And then the best route was found and flagged. And so quite a bit of work went into doing that. And then more recently, we added reflective markers along the trail as well, so that it's easier to follow at night. We haven't had a chance to test that yet, We were kind of expecting, because we had shorter days at the end of September, and we did do a through trip where we got into the cave a bit late and did some survey during the through trip. And so we expected to get out at dark, or after, after the sun was down, to be able to test those reflective markers. But we were a little too efficient. We managed to get out just before, and just in time to get up, hike up in daylight. But I have confidence the reflective markers will be pretty useful in the future. In total, we've surveyed 27 stations from the Great Exit. Only about a dozen of those are actually in the river, the stream, in what's called the Grim Crawl of Death. So there's another 35, maybe 40 survey shots remaining to finish the resurvey of that. And one of the things we did was when in the Grim Crawl, Adam Weaver and I went all the way upstream to the end of the Grim Crawl where it opens up, and then scouted upstream a little ways, and then kind of came back and went back through it again to get back out of the cave. So we got to sort of preview that. We'd been doing a lot of survey work from the upper entrance, but when we were planning to do a through trip, we didn't have anybody on the trip that had done the through trip before. Even the people we knew that had done the through trip, like Carl and Bob that were on the expedition, had done it in 2005. So it'd been 15 years. And when you ask them about it, I'm not sure they remember many details. So having them along, I'm not sure would have helped all that much with route finding. Once you get into the Lost Worland River, the route finding is not too bad. There's a couple spots, but we were a little concerned about the Grim Crawl because there's reports of the water sort of splitting and it's sort of a braided stream channel. So there's different ways you can go. And some of those, some of the paths the water takes reportedly get too low to follow. And then you'd have to back up against the current. And it sounds like a little dangerous. And so by previewing the Grim Crawl, we had a confidence about what we, had the most concerns about in terms of route finding. So I've got a short video clip to show you that you've got Hazel Barton on the left there, who is this year's NSS Science Award winner, and Renee Ohms on the right is this year's NSS Lou Bicking Award winner. So the two of them surveyed in the Grim Crawl, and I've got a short video clip to give you a sense for what the Grim Crawl looks like while they were surveying. For what a lot of the Grim Crawl is like. Most of it's similar to that. So most of it's about 2 feet high. You have to belly crawl. Almost none of it is high enough to even stoop in. So you're belly crawling. It's about 1,000 feet long, I mentioned before. And it's got about 6 inches of water through most of it. There are a few places where it drops to around 18 inches high with 6 inches of water, and the water's kind of flowing pretty fast, as you can see. So if you're going downstream through it, there are places where you can float a little bit and the water helps move you along. But you've got that Velcro dolomite sort of underneath everything, snagging on cave suits and cave packs. And so it's kind of annoying. So a little bit about our through trip in August. We had 5 people on the trip. I mentioned already, none of us had been all the way through, but we had seen quite a bit of it from the upstream end, and then had previewed the Grim Crawl. So we also had we had copies of the old map and some descriptions of that. the one thing we hadn't seen in terms of rigging is we hadn't been to Connection Falls yet. So we had rope with us, but we hadn't gotten that far in the survey. When we got there, the anchors were kind of a nightmare. We've since gone back in September and replaced those with stainless steel anchors. So they've been fixed now, but we had to rely on them in August, which is a little bit scary. We added a little bit of flagging to the river. There's sort of what I would characterize as 5 major bypasses to the river itself. The river does sump in a few spots, and there's a couple of sort of difficult sections where there's a dry cut around that you can take to avoid the river. Some of those cut arounds are pretty extensive. A couple of them I think are 40 or 50 survey shots. And there's a bit of route finding in a few places, so we added some flagging to make that a little easier. We completed the through trip in exactly 9 hours, which I think surprised us. If you listen to reports from people who've done it in the past, I mentioned the last trip was 2014, and the one before that was 2009. Both of those trips were 16 to 17 hours, and that seems to be pretty typical. 16 to 18 hours is what I hear for most through trips. Since we had pre-rigged some of the drops, we had fixed ropes, and we'd become very familiar with the route to the river and down the riverways. We had also had a chance to see the Grim Crawl. We felt pretty confident we could do it faster than 16 to 18 hours, and we were kind of hoping for somewhere around 12, although I thought that possibly could have been optimistic. And we ended up doing it in 9, which is pretty spectacular. I've asked around, I think the record is 7.5 hours, and that's Don Coons and Pete Shiflett did a solo crossover trip in 1985, which is written up in the NSS News. And on that solo trip, one of them made it through in about 7.5 hours. So a short video clip showing the start of our through trip.
Stop taking a picture.
All right, we ready?
Yeah.
Let's get it. Let's do it. Are we excited?
Yeah, close. Something.
About a half-mile hike from the campsite to the cave entrance. And that's the NSS property boundary. So the next video clip kind of shows you a little bit about the upper part of the cave, which is a really nice place to visit for recreational trips if you want to do a shorter, easier recreational trip. But I'll show a little bit about what that looks like, the Great Hall and so on. So at the end of the Great Hall, there's sort of the first rope pitch, assuming you don't use vertical gear in the entrance chimneys. So we put vertical gear on there, and then you get to this room. It's called base camp, also sometimes called the lunchroom, and you're just a few minutes travel to Lost Worland River from here. And so we stop here and put wetsuits on, vertical gear, because there's 3 rope pitches to get down to the river from the lunchroom. And then there's a series of rope drops that start pretty soon once you start heading downriver. So this is kind of a big gear up spot. But just a short video clip of the river itself. For what the Lost Worland River is like. Lots of these plunge pools, lots of climbing and chimneying, a little bit of rope work. Once you get below Connection Falls, there's no more ropes, but it's still a long distance from there out to the exit. And there is a bit of sort of easier passage towards the bottom before you get to the Grim Crawl. There's kind of like long straight stretches where there's not too much chimneying or climbing. But the last clip I have here is another short one of the Grim Crawl of Death, some of the lower spots in the Grim Crawl. I think I'll skip this slide. It's some of our learnings about effective gear. But some of the results of the expedition, we surveyed a little over 12,000 feet for the week, 2.3 miles. Collected some great quality photographs of the Great Hall, Cephalopod Malt Shop, the entrance area. We made some improvements to the infrastructure, so that's the trail at the exit as well as some of the rigging throughout the cave. And then we kind of accomplished one of the things that Bob had a concern about, which is getting more cavers familiar with the cave. So 5 of us that hadn't done it before have done the through trip, and another 7 cavers have seen the Grim Crawl. We have 9 cavers in total down in the Lost Worland River, and 12 cavers who hadn't been there before, involved in surveying in the Cephalopod Malt Shop and the Great Hall. So lots of people, few people that had been to the cave before, but quite a few people that had not, and have increased familiarity with it. And you can see we've been working on the map and adding to that. It's been updated quite a bit since what you see on the right there. I haven't worked on it since we went back in September. In fact, I haven't even entered the data yet. So I think there's about 4,000 feet of additional survey that's been done. So the total surveyed length at the end of August was 3 miles. We're probably getting close to 4 miles now. Most of that since last summer. So it's been pretty productive. And like I say, the travel distance now is on the order of 4 or 5 hours from the entrance to the end of the survey. So it's getting more difficult to do. We did a bit of survey on a through trip in September, and we between 2 survey teams, we added 1,600 feet of survey, and we'll probably try to extend our survey time and try to do even more on future trips. But going out to the end of the survey and coming back out the great entrance, I'm not sure is really practical anymore. It takes more time and energy to do that than it takes to just do a through trip. The through trip requires a little more logistics in terms of getting a vehicle down to the exit for so you can get back to camp. But otherwise, I think it's easier to just do a through trip and survey along the way. So anyway, those are some of the accomplishments from August. And this is my last slide. There's a QR code here if you want to, that'll take you to the Wyoming section of my website. And so a little plug for, I think folks that know me or probably know pretty well that I do a lot of videos on YouTube, and those cover, it's all caving related stuff, and they cover a wide range of subjects on caving, but there's trips and expedition type videos that I do, but I also do tutorials and gear reviews. And so I found that YouTube is doesn't have a great way of organizing content. So I started about a year ago, I started a website, and I've created basically a way to organize the video content that's on YouTube and sort of directs you towards that. But the types of information you would find on there, I've got a pretty good page, what I consider to be a pretty good page on how to get started caving. So for people that are new or interested in caving, I can direct them there. And then I've got fairly extensive libraries of videos and tutorials on cave survey. I'm going to start doing more on cave cartography. So I have a fair amount of content on my website on cartography, but I haven't produced any videos on this yet, but it's sort of in my plans to do that. Then I have a fair amount of content on vertical caving techniques and caving gear. The caving gear has been kind of a more recent thing. I've done some gear review videos, but if you go to the website, you can find quite a bit of information on almost any type of caving gear you can think of. So that's the website, derekbristol.com. If you go there, you can find more information. That's my little plug for that. I want to thank the photographers that provided photos for the presentation. Most of those are Hazel's photos, but Kevin, Ben, Carl, and Renee provided some as well. And I think that's the last slide, so I'll stop this if I can get my cursor.